The mysterious incident we're about to describe remained unsolved for a long time. Each new detail only complicated the picture, contrary to the usual logic of investigation. It seemed that this mystery would remain unsolved. However, as it turned out later, the key to solving it lay in simple observation. Our story begins in the Texas city of Beaumont. On September 16, 2010, the phone in room 348 of the Elegante Hotel rang continuously. It was Susan Fleniken calling, who usually spoke with her husband, Greg Fleniken, every morning. But this morning was unusual. She had been unable to reach her husband for several hours. Usually, Greg answered right away, but today something was off. Moreover, Greg didn't show up for work at 9 a.m., which was already a red flag. His colleague went to the hotel. He explained the situation to the receptionist, who escorted him to room 348. There was no answer to their knock. When they opened the door, the reason for the silence became clear. On the floor lay the body of 55-year-old Greg Fleniken. The arriving medics confirmed the death. The detective, after examining the room, found no signs of a crime. There were no signs of a struggle. Greg's body was lying face down, with no visible injuries. In his left hand, he held a cigarette. On the bed were an ashtray, a chocolate bar, and the remote for the turned-on TV. The only oddity was the turned-off air conditioner despite the stifling heat in the room. The balcony door was slightly ajar, which was the only detail that puzzled the police. Overall, everything suggested that Greg had died of natural causes, most likely from a heart attack. The body was handed over to the medical examiner, and it was from this moment that the case began to accumulate mysteries. At first glance, the circumstances of Greg Fleniken's death seemed quite ordinary. On the table lay a 55-year-old man, in good physical shape for his age. During a thorough examination, the expert discovered a wound on the deceased's left cheek, where his face had touched the floor, and more interestingly, a torn wound in the scrotum area. This discovery drew attention. The scrotum was swollen and discolored, with a small accumulation of fluid around the wound. It appeared that Greg had received a blow to this area. The story his body was telling was becoming increasingly mysterious. When opening the chest and abdominal cavity, the expert found extensive internal bleeding and serious organ damage. The liver was injured, 2 ribs were broken, and a wound was found in the heart. The condition of the internal organs indicated severe trauma. It became clear that Greg had died as a result of a beating. The doctor suggested that the injury to the groin area was likely caused by a kick. Additionally, the man had received such a strong blow to the chest that it led to his death. The most perplexing aspect remained the absence of external signs of such serious injuries on Greg's body. Despite this, the expert's conclusion now stated cause of death, homicide. At this point, it's worth mentioning a bit about the deceased's background. Greg was 55 years old and married to Susan. The couple had no children, but interestingly, Susan had married Greg twice. This first happened when she was only 20. At the time, Susan was performing in a rock band. When she met Greg, she was charmed by him. Their first marriage lasted 5 years, but then constant arguments began. The hot-tempered Susan filed for divorce, and they separated. A couple of years later, she decided to call Greg. Hearing her voice, he immediately said, "I knew you'd call." Soon they were at the altar again. Since then, their union had been almost perfect. The only downside was frequent separations. Their home was in Lafayette, but Greg often had to travel to other cities for work. For the past year, he had been spending 5 days a week in Beaumont, almost always staying at the Elegante Hotel. The fact of murder came as a complete surprise to the detective who inspected room 348. The door was locked, and there were no signs of struggle. Greg's wallet remained in the room. The balcony door was ajar, but it seemed impossible to access the 3rd floor from the street. Given Greg's injuries, He should have screamed in pain, but none of the neighbors heard anything. It appeared that someone had entered without a key, brutally beat Greg without making a sound, and left without leaving any traces. And most importantly, why? During the investigation, it was discovered that at 7:45 p.m., the circuit breaker in Greg's room tripped, cutting off power to room 348. Greg called the manager, who sent a worker named Brian Altris, who had a key to the room, to make repairs. The problem was that the detectives had already spoken with Brian, but for some reason, he had concealed this information. Although this didn't prove anything yet, it provided a lead, especially after Altris's past came to light. It turned out that the man had previously been convicted of attempting of a roommate. Considering that Greg regularly stayed at the Elegante Hotel, it was speculated that he might have caught Altris's attention. It's possible that when the worker came to fix the circuit breaker, something happened between them. It's not out of the question that Altris, being a large man, might have tried to coerce Greg into sex, was rejected, and in a fit of rage, beat him, causing those injuries. This theory seemed logical. However, Brian Altris successfully passed the lie detector test, which practically eliminated him as a suspect. Fortunately, the investigators got another lead. They obtained a printout of calls from Greg's phone, where they discovered numerous suspicious numbers belonging to prostitutes and even drug dealers. This information shocked Greg's acquaintances, as they considered him an exemplary family man, not prone to alcohol or drugs. However, it seemed Greg had another side to his life. For the detectives, such a situation wasn't surprising. A man spending most of his time away from his wife resorting to the services of prostitutes, quite a common story. Although it's unlikely that a girl could have inflicted serious injuries on Greg, such women usually don't work alone. They're accompanied by pimps. Greg likely had a conflict with a pimp during payment, which could have led to him being beaten. The detectives checked all phone numbers, but none of the owners were at the hotel on the night of Greg's death. This seemed nonsensical. Everything about this case was illogical. A question arose: did Greg really make these calls? If not, who did? The answer was found only after a week of investigation. It turned out that the federal agency had mixed up Greg's phone records with those of another man, a drug dealer. The police received the wrong document, which wasted a lot of the detectives' time. Greg's correct phone records didn't provide any new leads. All calls were related to work or family, nothing unusual. Soon the evidence hit a dead end, and the case was archived. Few believed it would be solved. About 6 months after Greg's death, his family hired a private detective, Ken Brennan, a former police officer. This brought a fresh perspective to the case. The police detective who had previously led the investigation gave Ken Brennan access to all the materials. Ken reconstructed the following sequence of events. Around 7 to 8 p.m., Greg returned to his room. He turned on the microwave to heat up food, which caused a power outage. Greg called for maintenance. Brian Altris visited room 348. At 8:30 p.m., Altris turned on the circuit breaker and warned Greg not to use the air conditioner and microwave simultaneously. Greg called for maintenance. Brian Altris visited room 348. At 8:30 p.m., Altris turned on the circuit breaker and warned Greg not to use the air conditioner and microwave simultaneously. In Bamment, the heat was unbearable, and Ken theorized that after Altris left, Greg turned off the air conditioner. He likely died within 15 to 30 minutes after that, as the air conditioner was never turned on again. Thus, Greg's death occurred around 9 p.m. Now, it was necessary to figure out what happened in the room between 8:30 and 9 p.m. While examining crime scene photos, Private Detective Ken noticed one detail. Although Greg was right-handed, the cigarette was in his left hand. This meant that at the time of death, his right hand was occupied with something. Ken speculated that the deceased might have been heading to the door, intending to open it with his right hand. But why? To let someone in or to leave the room himself? Private Detective Ken re-interviewed guests in neighboring rooms, after which he reported to the police. "I think I know how this man died, when it happened, who killed him, and how we can catch the perpetrator. But first, we need to go back to room 348 and find something," Ken stated. The police officer asked what exactly they would be looking for. "A bullet hole," the detective replied. Returning to the hotel, to room 348, they thoroughly examined the closets, beds, carpet, nightstands, and walls, and eventually found what they were looking for. A small hole resembling a bullet mark was found in one of the walls. This became a new turning point in the investigation. Ken went to the doctor who performed the autopsy. The detective shared his theory about the gunshot wound. The doctor was skeptical for a long time but eventually admitted that if the bullet had entered the body at a certain angle, it could explain the internal damage. The bullet passed through the wall and hit Greg, who was lying on the bed. It entered at such an angle that it damaged his liver, broke 2 ribs, and grazed his heart. Greg jumped out of bed, trying to leave the room, but died within seconds. The question was, why was the shot fired? On the night of Greg's death, 3 electricians were in room 349, Tim Steinmetz, Lance Mueller, and Trent Passano. The interrogation began with Steinmetz. More than 6 months had passed, and the man felt confident. He claimed they were drinking in the room and didn't hear anything. Detective Ken Brennan asked him to write down his statement and sign it. Steinmetz complied and asked if he could leave. The detective replied that he could have left at any time before signing, but now he would go to jail for giving false testimony, as they knew he hadn't told the whole truth. At this moment, Steinmetz broke down and revealed what really happened that night. On September 15, 2010, Steinmetz, Mueller, and Passano were indeed drinking in room 349. Like the deceased Greg, they occasionally stayed at the Elegante Hotel. Lance Mueller had a firearm with him. At some point, while playing with the gun, he accidentally fired a shot into the wall. The men heard Greg scream but decided to pretend they had nothing to do with it. Instead of providing help, they masked the hole with toothpaste. For unknown reasons, none of the hotel staff noticed or paid attention to this hole. After the incident, the 3 men went down to the bar while Greg was dying in room 348. As a result, in June 2011, Lance Mueller was arrested for the murder of Greg Fleniken. The other 2 men who were with him that night were not charged and were only witnesses in the case. Mueller, being a family man with no criminal history, received 10 years in prison for Greg's murder. This absurd crime ruined the lives of both Greg and Mueller. The case would likely have remained unsolved if not for the efforts of the private detective. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and support the channel by subscribing. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.